I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
What do you think only you could do? I think that's also good advice. What is the thing that only you could do? Like, instead of trying to copy someone that you think is more successful, like, what is the point of view that you bring that's really unique, that's missing in the world? And I think that's like a good compass to use when you're trying to work out what you want to do.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Tran Lam is a freelance journalist. She has a fascinating curiosity about the culinary world and goes about documenting it with wild enthusiasm. She has written for every worthy food publication in Australia and is also the host of many a podcast herself. Today she joins me to talk more about edibles and her food and drink adventures. Hi Tran, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on your wonderful show.
Oh, thank you for listening, first of all, for occasionally listening to the podcast, but also it's so lovely to have you. I've got a million questions for you because I find you and your life pretty amazing.
Well, hopefully I can answer them all. And sorry to burst the bubble. It's probably not as amazing as you think it is. But yeah, we can dive into that.
I don't doubt that there's probably some hard work involved and some unglamorous things that do happen, like most jobs. But tell me a little bit about where your kind of journey with the love of food all began.
Yeah, so I guess my food media career began semi-accidentally. I've always worked in the media. I started 20-something years ago as an editorial assistant on a magazine. And like a lot of the magazines I worked on, either we were all made redundant or they closed down the magazine and you were kind of turfed onto the street and had to find a new job, which kind of tells you a bit about the volatility of working in the media landscape. You're never quite sure if you'll have a job tomorrow or not. And I was actually working at an interiors magazine called Inside Out in 2007 when I started a food blog called The Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry. And this is sort of the era when I guess food blogs were the main alternative to like traditional food media. You had Helen Yee with Grab Your Fork. I think it was like the first one running in Australia and just doing a really awesome job of documenting like a wide variety of places you can eat out at. And for me, what inspired that was it was the first time in my life I had more than like pizza money. Like if you saved up for a bit, you could go to a nice restaurant. And it was really interesting. Actually, it was Bentley restaurant in Sydney that inspired me to start doing the blog because I think it was one of the few times where we had saved up a bit of money, but in previous occasions we'd gone to a nice restaurant and people would like sneer at us with these young people in their sneakers and their backpacks. And, I remember one time a waiter going like, ugh, would you like me to take your backpack? You know what I mean? Just because we weren't investment bankers, they were like a little bit snooty to us. But I remember when we went to Bentley with some friends in our 20s, they actually treated us like probably as nicely as they would treat the investment bankers. And I was like, oh, wow, you don't have to be treated like rubbish if you don't earn $1 zillion, if you go to like a really nice restaurant. And I think in general, I think in Sydney that attitude's really changed. That you can go to like a lot of pretty fancy restaurants and turn up in your sneakers and backpack and be treated pretty well. But I remember at the time going like, wow, this is really nice not to be treated like you're interlopers for coming to this nice restaurant. But also I remember actually I didn't do the wine tasting that night, but some friends did. And I remember the sommelier did such a great job of like giving you a postcard of every region and, where the wine had come from. But also the food was so incredible. And I thought I'd hate for it to be lost. Sometimes you have an amazing experience and if you don't document it somehow, it just disappears. So the blog was a way to I guess, freeze frame or distill these great moments of dining out in Sydney. And it was also like a really, I think I can't even think of the word, but there was a lot of change happening in the Sydney dining scene at the time because I think maybe the small bar, I guess, revolution was about to happen, but there was a lot of change within the fine dining scene where you had a lot of young chefs kind of start out their own restaurants. So your Dan Hongs and your Mitch Orrs and, your Claire Van Vuren's working at really top restaurants and going, hey, we want to open something but that's a bit more fun. At the time, the kind of dining that really reigned and won lots of awards were like really expensive kind of French style restaurants, and these guys were kind of opening places that were a bit more accessible, a bit more fun, had a lot of different influences where maybe like ramen or Japanese mayo might or tater tots. I remember at Mitch Orr's Duke Bistro, they put like a dish on that was just a very fancy version of tater tots, but it was so good. So it was actually a really exciting time to kind of be, trying to capture the scene at that time.
First off, the unbearable lightness of being hungry is the best name I have ever heard. I don't know where you came up with that, but it is genius. But I want to go back even further. What was food like growing up kind of in your household? Were your family good cooks, or did you cook yourself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of people who grew up in migrant households in Australia, particularly a few decades ago, I think there was a lot of um, I guess I didn't appreciate what I had at the time because I remember watching ads on TV for like McDonald's and going, I don't even live in a place that has a McDonald's. This is so sad. But my parents would take me out and we would have, a lot of Vietnamese food because I grew up in Cabramatta where there's like and still is a strong like Vietnamese kind of like culinary influence in the area because of the refugees who had come out after the Vietnam War. But I didn't really appreciate that I could go to like the local markets and get like lychees and rambutans and all sorts of incredible food experiences. I was like, why can't I get like, French fries? And, when a KFC opened in Cabramatta, I was so excited. And then it closed down because it didn't do very well. And I felt so ashamed that like, we couldn't even keep this KFC going. But now, of course, being older and looking back and going, oh my God, you can go to Macca's anywhere. Like that is so, I guess, it's such a cardboard cookie cutter kind of experience. Like, whereas what's exciting about Cabramatta is so unique within the Sydney and Australian dining scene. And I remember Andrew Levin's fellow food writer once saying that like going to Cabramatta to eat is as a quintessential Sydney experience as like seeing the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Oh, I like that. I can completely get on board, and what a wealth of amazing venues out that way. I would like to know, like, what kind of an eater were you as a child? Being somebody that's got a young baby, I hope one day he'll be a child that wants to eat everything, but it certainly doesn't start as easy as I imagine it. Were you always somebody that was happy to eat anything put in front of you?
I think I was really lucky in the household we grew up with, and we lived with a lot of people under the one household, so lots of aunties. I shared a bedroom with my grandmother, so it was not the most spacious situation, but in terms of, when you sit down to dinner, there'll be like multiple dishes on the table. So, there might be like stir-fried egg with bitter melon and like lots of pepper, or, I mean, I didn't love it at the time, but now I really have come to appreciate it at an older age. I remember like these steaming vats of tofu that add like a ginger syrup to, and I think as a kid the ginger was too strong for my taste buds, but now I think that would just be so delicious, like that very pure tasting tofu with that very bracing hit of ginger and like a bit of sweetness as well.
I suppose they do say these days it's all about just, having food accessible and letting, children see and that's exactly what you had. You had the opportunity to see and smell and taste lots of different dishes. I'm interested when you were talking about your blog earlier, when you started writing a blog, and I do remember times where I used to, really follow a few blogs, and I loved because you really heard that first person voice. When you started that, had you had much of a kind of study and career path in journalism to start with? Where were you at when you started that blog?
Yeah, so at that time, I was onto like my third magazine job, and I was working as something called a deputy chief sub editor, which sounds really fancy, and sadly the job doesn't really exist anymore. But basically, sub editors would fact check a story, they would come up with a headline, they would write the captions, they would write the introductions, and because I was working at an interiors magazine, there were a lot of people around me who were really talented, who were flexing their creativity in really inspiring ways. But I was, fact checking the prices of like taps and the names of carpets. And I do remember I worked with such awesome people who really inspired me, but the day to day nitty gritty of, checking what is the name of this chair or is this tile really whatever dollars per square meter. It's not the most like brain sparking kind of, occupation. So doing the blog actually let me be creative because in that role, the most creative thing you'd probably do is maybe come up with a headline that's, 5 words long. So I actually really appreciated having an outlet to do that. And also it was good because people at work saw me doing that and then they asked me to do like a blog at work, and that was also a really great opportunity to try and like get the inside out message to like maybe a different audience. So the two sort of influenced each other, which was nice.
I suppose when in hindsight, when we always look back at our careers, even the most menial tasks often taught you something about something you needed to know along the line. And if you have the wisdom, I suppose, to see it later down the track.
Yeah, and you also end up with weird skills which are maybe very limited in purpose, but like I can spot when there are two spaces in a row. Like I can go, okay, they need to delete that space. Like you end up with. I remember my first boyfriend. He was a pizza delivery driver at one stage, and he had this really good skill of being able to spot house numbers in the dark. So I think all those early jobs, maybe they're not the most inspiring, but I think especially that job, I've always had a real sense that you fact checking is really important. Making sure you talk to the right people is important, and that's always been instilled in me from getting that training in working in magazines from when I started.
Yeah, you sound like you've definitely had all the fundamentals for success. Did you actually do some formal study for writing?
Yeah, it's hilarious because I don't think they even would give this degree anymore. But I did a print media degree, and given that I don't know if many people even have print media in their diet anymore. But I still I subscribe to like Gourmet Traveler magazine, and I try to support. Magazines where I can. Like, you've had Miffy Rigby on an earlier episode, and I've definitely gone out and bought copies of Swirl magazine. So I'm aware that people's media diet is changing, but I don't know if this is a good excuse to tell a story that I thought was really lovely. But I wrote a piece for the Sunday newspaper, the Sun Herald, about native foodways, this great Indigenous bakery in the Sydney CBD. And actually, they have this really awesome lemon myrtle ginger beer that Corey Gretsch, who works there, he runs a brewery that also does that. And when it came out, there was an older woman who cut out the article from the newspaper and went down to Native Foodways, kind of using that article as her navigational guide, which I thought was really lovely. It's always nice when something you write actually inspires someone to like check out a place, especially a place that's really celebrating First Nations talent and culture and ingredients. And their bread is so good. The best, one of the best loaves in Sydney. But Corey told me that story, and then he told me that like four other older women had cut out articles like her and gone down to find the bakery that way. And I think that's quite a juxtaposition to all the people who said, oh, yeah, I tried to read the story, but it was paywalled on the website, so I didn't. So it's kind of just telling you a bit about how people's, I guess, reading habits have changed according to their age and generation, I suppose.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show how important all the different avenues of publication are, because they do reach different demographics. And like you said, you want people to be able to discover new things in their lives, and not just have the same group of people in one restaurant. You want all the walks of life. So I think that it's great that we think on a more kind of broad scope of where we get our information and how. But I'd like to know a little bit, is it, you don't eat meat, is that correct?
Oh, yes, I'm a vegetarian. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and how did that decision come about? If I'm not too prying and asking.
Yeah. Well, it's not. I mean, too strange a concept, because when I was growing up, our parents are Buddhist, so like vegetarian cuisine is a big part of Buddhism, and would go to temple and would eat vegetarian food at temple. And I remember when I was 16, and one of my first internet friends sent me a very long email explaining why he'd become vegetarian. And it was very graphic. It was describing, the chickens in these industrial farms being, only allowed to have like an A4 sized, sheet of paper, that much room. And I just remember like physically feeling quite ill after he described all of this in graphic detail. And I thought, well, I don't have to eat meat. And in a way, I think it's good, because it forced me to like just not eat the same thing all the time. I think I would, maybe just eat, I don't know, white bread Devon sandwiches with tomato sauce every day. If I hadn't turned vegetarian, like some people think, oh, well, doesn't that restrict what you can eat? But actually, it forces you to try lots of different things, because sometimes you'll go to a place and they only have one vegetarian thing, and you have to try that because that's the only option. So you actually can't be too fussy about what you eat. And, it's really interesting how much the culinary landscape has changed, because as I've been following it over the last however many years, it's only become more like there are more plant-based options, there's more vegan menus. And, at the same time, I'm not like a big drinker either. And it's been interesting to see the rise in like non-alcoholic pairings or non-alcoholic choices. Like I remember writing in 2016 for Good Food about that, and it seemed like a novelty because no one else was really covering it. I think Momofuku Siebo, Ambrose Chang, and Richard Hargreave at the time were like the only people doing, or they were definitely the first. Maybe there were a few joining them around 2016, but doing a non-alcoholic pairing was quite radical when Siebo did it, and then a few other people kind of joined them. I think I remember interviewing Max Gertler, who was at Rockpool, and I think now he's at Encore, and he was doing really interesting sodas that sounded really left field and really creative. And now there's just such a massive market for it. Like when there was an article on Heaps Normal in Good Weekend a few years ago, I think maybe it was Mike Benny at the beloved bottle shop P&V, saying that Heaps Normal, the non-alco beer, actually outsold the 50 other beers that they sell at P&V. So it just shows you how interesting is how things have shifted in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when you were mentioning earlier about, the service you received of someone with sneakers on as a backpack just boggled my mind, and I do remember those days, not necessarily in Australia, but around the world, where you were, and how you dressed was a big deal. And it blows my mind just how far we've come now, and to kind of be stoked that you received somewhat respectful service because you were in sneakers and a backpack. It just makes me shudder. But restaurants have come a very long way in their offerings in the last decade, and I think they'll continue to do so in terms of different arrays of drinks and I mean, I think it's only going to go from there, right? The way we see things and smell things, it's going to become all sensory, and it's definitely an exciting time. But I'd like to know a bit about your first. Do you remember a moment after writing so many incredible stories? Um, do you ever remember like a time where you wrote, I don't know, a first publication where you were excited to go out and buy it and you just couldn't believe that you were writing for a magazine? Is there a moment like that that kind of stays with you?
Yeah, this was when I was 16, and there was this youth publication called VoiceWorks. And I think they published, I can't remember if it was people under 21 or people under 25. And I remember I got paid $90 at the time. And I was like, oh my God, $90. This is like more money than I could, ever think. What would I do with 90 whole dollars? I can't believe this. And I remember like taking it to school and showing people, and, that was definitely exciting. And there are, every now and again, there is a moment like that when something comes out. Like, I think when I did the Eater 38 essential restaurant story, which was like a really massive, like I've never lost more sleep over a story. Like it was sort of like 2 days straight where I actually didn't sleep to try and get it done on time. But also knowing that like the Eater essential restaurant maps, because I've used them before when I've gone to Japan, and I know they're quite widely read and taken very seriously. So I really sweated over like, oh my God, like, because you can't, like 38, you can't feature every single place you love in Sydney, but you also have to tell a story about Sydney that really attempts to capture how diverse and exciting and the different ranges of places. Like Eater have a really good rule that it has to be diverse, not just in on the cuisine front, but it has to be diverse geographically and diverse in terms of budget, so in terms of spend. So it can't be like, just restaurants that are all tasting menu restaurants in the centre of Sydney. You really have to try and capture the scope of dining in Sydney, and that it's not just for tourists. You have to imagine that locals, you want to come up with something that locals would want to read as well.
That's such a good philosophy. I really love that. In terms of, I want to hear a little bit about podcasts because you have done quite a few, and I want to hear a little bit about your time with FBI Radio. But before we move into the podcast scene, if somebody wanted to crack their way into food journalism, what would be your best advice on how they go about that in today's age?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's also a tricky one because the food media landscape is changing so much. And even when I started, it was a bit volatile. And even now, there's, very sadly, we've seen, especially in America, like a lot of places have laid off people or closed down. Like I think Vice just recently closed down. Not that long ago, places like Vice and BuzzFeed were seen as like invincible, they're like former versions of themselves now. So it's really tricky. I guess it depends on how you even define food media and, what is it that people want to do? Do they want to start a podcast? Do they want to start like a YouTube cooking series? Do they want to write a cookbook? Like there are different avenues depending on what you want to do. I think when I think of how I got into food media, and it's through a very sort of accidental way where I think at the time I thought, well, probably no one's going to hire me because I'm a vegetarian, don't really drink very much, and I'm just going to cover the things that I'm interested in. And then I did that enough that people like, oh, we kind of like what you do, so can we get you to, write about cafes? Can we get you to write, for the Good Food Guide, which Joanna Saville very kindly asked me to do. So I think the main thing is to like develop your own voice, pick out what you want to do. I think it should be something you really enjoy doing, that it doesn't matter if you're not getting 100,000 viewers or readers or so on. Because I did my blog for a really long time before anyone took notice, and it was actually good to make some mistakes, kind of work out what you actually want to do, what you think works. I think it's more important to try and develop your own voice before you start, I don't know, pitching newspapers or, trying to go for bigger gigs. And like for me, I didn't really know anything about podcasts when I started mine. And actually, the way I learned how to use my Zoom recorder was I actually bought the equipment before going to a friend's wedding, but I didn't have enough time to drop off the equipment because I bought it at Turramurra Music, which was like the only place at the time to buy a Zoom recorder. And so I was hauling all this audio gear to this friend's wedding, and people go like, what is this? What are you doing? And a friend of mine actually had been working on podcasts for, I think, maybe the Sydney Theatre Company. Says, okay, you press this button and you do this, and yeah, that's how you record a podcast. And so that's how I learned how to make podcasts, essentially, and a lot of YouTube, and it was very, very self-taught. And then I guess along the way, much further down the line, I got to do podcasts with SBS recently, and also the Powerhouse Museum. And yeah, so I think I could have only gotten to that stage if I did it on my own for a little while to try and understand what works and what doesn't work. So I would say maybe don't rush out and think you're going to be like a media superstar overnight. Like, decide what you're really into. Because I imagine with you, like, you just love doing this podcast, you love interviewing people. And if it turns out 1,000,000 people listen to it or 10 people listen to it, I imagine you go in with the same level of enthusiasm and care because you just really love doing this.
Yeah, you've kind of hit the nail on the head for the fact that if you go out and try to do a podcast to make yourself a lot of money, you're kind of doomed at the start anyway. So if you end up doing it because you just love it, that love then usually translates, but it also means if it's not successful, you're already kind of winning because you didn't set out for it to be that way. So I kind of know what you mean. And it's, I suppose, the same when you're talking about having a voice and figuring out why you want to write or video yourself or whatever it may be. You've got to want to kind of love it to do it. And you've got to kind of want to generally have that need to wake up early or work on your weekends because, that's just what makes you happy. And I agree. I think that if the podcast was never listened to, I would still get so much out of it because I learned so much from listening to other people's stories. So, yeah, I agree with you completely.
And I would also point out probably what drove you to start the podcast is you felt maybe something was missing, or it was just a way of like covering drinks media that no one had really done before. And I think what would probably inspire people is maybe they're like, hey, I don't know, there's not enough coverage of, say, Egyptian cooking, or there's not enough, like, why is no one doing stuff on Persian food or whatever it happens to be, you know what I mean? Or I reckon someone should go out and rate all the non-alcoholic beverages out there because they vary so widely, and that's why I want to, I don't know, start a TikTok about that or a podcast about that. So I think it's also driven by what do you think only you could do? I think that's also good advice. What is the thing that only you could do? Like, instead of trying to copy someone that you think is more successful, like, what is the point of view that you bring that's really unique, that's missing in the world? And I think that's like a good compass to use when you're trying to work out what you want to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, we're often asked that question, aren't we? Straight out of school, what do you want to be? And it's just like, whoa, who even am I? What, like, it's such a, a big question at such an early age. And you figure it out most of the time through diverting through many degrees and courses to figure out, what is your contribution to this earth? But I want to ask a bit about your time with FBI Radio because you worked there for quite some time. How did that come about and what did you get out of that experience?
Yeah, so I was a volunteer. I think I started volunteering in 2005, so quite a while back. And then my first radio show, I think, was 2006. But actually, the first time I learned how to use a radio console, the guy who taught me, Brendan King, he was actually a chef. He'd worked at some like top Sydney restaurants, and at the time he was working at Burke Street Bakery. So we really loved him at FBI because he would always come in with these trays of like chocolate tarts and other great things from Burke Street Bakery. So, even though that was a volunteer experience, and my mum would say stuff like, why would you do stuff for free? If you're really good, they would pay they would pay you. And I was like, that's not how a community radio station works. But it was really good. I think it really helped give me confidence behind the microphone. And also I met some of the best people I've met in my life through that. And actually Andrew Levins, who, does a few podcasts of his own and also is quite popular on Instagram and TikTok, and actually has a great story in Swirl magazine about a food manga or comic called Oshinbo. We had a chat, which is what led to me doing the Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry podcast, because he wanted to set up a podcast network at FBI. And even though that didn't end up happening, that is what kind of sparked, the idea for the Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry. And actually, when I talk about the volatility in food, or in actual media, like traditional media, I had just been made redundant, and I was like, instead of being really sad about this, which I had been in previous times where you're just out of work and you have no money and it is very much a bummer, I thought I'm going to start a podcast so I can at least channel energy towards something positive. That actually came out of like a pretty crappy time. So I think FBI was also good in that it teaches you to be, I guess, proactive, because a lot of the stuff you're doing it yourself because, it's a scrappy community radio station with, not heaps and heaps of money. It's pretty much run by volunteers. And it was good because it meant you went out and you got interviews with interesting people. And again, I think it's good to be around people who are really enthusiastic from a real range of age groups and experiences as well. It was really inspiring to be there.
Wow, it sounds amazing. And it's been, I kind of think living in Australia, you kind of come across FBI some point in your life, and what a contribution. You were there for 16 years, is that right?
Yeah, I had a show that was on for 16 years, Local Fidelity. So I think I started like maybe 2 years before that. So yeah, it was quite a while. It was quite a chunk of time.
Gosh, that's amazing. They are so lucky to have you, and that is just such a cool story. I love that. Now, when you go out to eat these days, you're often writing about the places you're in. You said that you're not a huge drinker. What is the kind of things that you typically order, or are you always looking to have something different when you're, at a restaurant having a different cuisine? What are you drinking most of the time?
Yeah, it's interesting. And now there's such a range of things, whereas before, if you're not going to have some wine or beer, it used to be like, well, you can just have some water, or a Coke. And now there's such a range. And I think that can be good and bad. Like I've tasted some really amazing things that are so interesting. Like I think I went to the Tap House and they had this really interesting drink that was like, I can't remember if it was like fermented lemongrass and ginger and strawberry, but it was quite a few things kind of all fizzy together and really like beautiful and delicious. And I think when I went to King Clarence, they also had something really amazing. But I think it can be really hit and miss when you go to places and you order the non-alcoholic option, because sometimes it's like, oh, this actually tastes like really expensive cordial and I've paid $20 for it and I feel a bit crap about that, but good on them for giving it, having a go. But if you order a few in a row, you're like, oh, they were all not good, and that's like $60 down the drain. You do feel a bit disappointed. So yeah, I'd love it if there was, more coverage of this, because with certain drinks, there is a certain expectation, or you kind of, if you, I don't know, order Negroni or Chenin Blanc, you kind of know what you're getting. But with non-alco drinks, sometimes it's so wide ranging, and it can be really awesome or really like, oh, I should have just gotten a ginger beer. But anyway, where do I like to? We have mentioned P&V before, and I think P&V have like an awesome like non-alco option. Like in Newtown at the front, you can find something like the Altered Kakadu Kitchen Native Peach Bellini, which has a really fascinating story behind that, and also um, a really great way of like supporting First Nations entrepreneurs and culture and knowledge and ingredients. And they'll have the pie wackets shrubs, which are really delicious. I think they're made up in northern New South Wales. I've bought the blood orange turmeric shrub. So, like, I think I've spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars when I think about how many bottles I've bought. But they also have, like, obviously a really interesting selection of boozy drinks as well. So if I want to go, like, get a yuzu sake, that's where I'll go to grab a bottle. I think that they get it from Black Market Sake, who usually get really interesting sakes of, it might be something from, I've just completely forgotten the name, but it's that place in Chiba, the sake brewery in Chiba, and they sing like they've been making sake for like 400 years, and they sing when they're like mash for the sake. Terada Honke, that's the name. So I like that you can find such a range of stuff. Now, I remember like maybe 10 or so years ago, to get yuzu sake, you couldn't really get it. And my boyfriend was like in LA, and he had to like get it ordered to someone who lived in LA, and he had to pick it up and bring it back to Australia. Like, that's how hard it used to be. And now you can just like, go to P&V or somewhere that Black Market or other sake distributors are selling and get a delicious yuzu sake.
From a tiny artisanal producer that, like you said, makes hardly anything. But P&V is amazing, and Mike is at the absolute, he's the tiny tip of the toe in terms of the front foot of what's happening in the world of drinks, and such amazing for you to have that kind of close by as one of your local stores. I'm extremely jealous, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, well, they have a great online shop if you're not so close. They're really like, I've sent presents to people, and it's ended up on their doorstep the next day from the P&V store.
Very true, very true. In terms of podcasting now, I mean, you listen to a few podcasts, but what would be, your advice for somebody that hosts podcasts? What do you think makes a good podcast host?
I think definitely passion is so necessary. And given, like, there are a zillion podcasts out there, so I think trying to have a unique point of view really helps. And I think also the hard thing is, like, when I started, there weren't as many podcasts out there, and you had to explain to people what a podcast is. And now, like, every celebrity has their own podcast, and every TV show has a podcast. So the good and bad thing is, like, there's more visibility for podcasts, but it's harder to kind of break out because there's just so many. Sometimes the thing that I find hard is when I listen to podcasts and you're like, oh, maybe that didn't have to be like a 2-hour podcast. Like, maybe like just edit it back just a bit and have like the best, you want to leave people go, oh, wow, wasn't that great? And I could have listened to that forever, rather than like, oh, I had to fast forward the last half because I couldn't get through it. So I would say just edit back a bit more. Like, you don't have to put everything in the actual final file.
I think that's really good advice. I'd like to know, now that you've come to this place in your career where you're highly successful in your realms, who do you look up to? Is there someone that's been a mentor for you, someone that you still really, appreciate their advice, that you bounce ideas off?
Wow, it's so funny because I think highly successful is such a funny. I don't feel highly successful, so that's it's nice that you say that. But I'm like, oh, I just got a pitch rejected today, so I don't feel that successful. And also being a freelancer can be really up and down, and sometimes you have those really down moments where you're like, oh, am I ever going to work again? And so, yeah, it can be really up and down. People I definitely have huge admiration for. I think Farah Soldier, who's managing editor at SBS Food, like she's incredible. The energy she has for the many projects she does, like she's on the Cook Up with Adam Liao, but SBS Food has been such a great platform for running such a like a true diversity of stories where, you might read about, they had a story, I think last year, about a woman who was like a South Korean, I think maybe she was a volleyball player. She came out for the Olympics and she ended up in Adelaide and she's been running the same eatery for maybe 3 decades. And even though she's making Korean food, so she's making kimbap, which people kind of say is like sushi, but it is a bit different. But back then she had to call it sushi because people didn't even know what Korean food was. So she had to call it by like a Japanese, semi-equivalent, but that this woman has had, the same eatery for decades and decades. And, those are the kind of like lesser known stories that I think SBS has been really good at showcasing. And I've had like really great opportunities to cover such a range of stories. Like, so when I did my podcast, Should You Really Eat That with SBS? And I got to do some stories related to the things we discussed. So there's a coffee episode. And I know that even though I'm like a dinosaur and I'm not personally on TikTok because I'm too old for TikTok, but I know that adding salt to your coffee supposedly to take away the bitterness was like this big thing that got like a lot of traction on TikTok. And what's interesting to me is actually adding salt to your coffee is this really old Turkish wedding tradition where you are meant to like give it to the groom, and if he doesn't like flinch, that's a sign he's like a really, he's a husband who's going to handle a lot of challenging situations. So I got to write a story about that and like dive a bit into Turkish coffee culture, which is so fascinating. Like in the Turkish language, there are different words for like fatigue coffee and pleasure coffee. And I talked to FA from Malika Bakehouse about that. He was saying, so fatigue coffee might be like, ugh, you're at work and you really need to get through all these chores. And then pleasure coffee might be like, oh, you've done all your chores for the day and you sit down on the couch with your loved one and you watch a Turkish soap opera. But also what I also find fascinating is there's this big tradition of reading coffee grounds, like fortune telling via looking at people's coffee grounds. And his mother used to do it. But there's this app that is so popular. I think at one point it was more popular than Tinder, where you take a photo of your coffee grounds and you upload it to this app and it would tell you your fortunes. I just thought like that that is a way of looking at Turkish coffee culture from many angles, and I feel like SBS Food is just one of those places that allows you to do that, and I'm really grateful for that platform for letting these stories exist.
I totally agree. I feel like ABC iView and SBS On Demand are just constantly on my TV. There's not really a lot else. I don't pay for a lot of TV, and because there's just a wealth of amazing shows and stories out there that they've uncovered. I really agree with you. They do an amazing job, and Farah certainly knows what she's doing. So that's awesome. I'd like to know a little bit about what your kind of go-tos are in your local areas. Is there a coffee, tea, a drink place that you go to have a little sip on something on a hot day, or a favourite place that you have in your area?
Oh, yeah. So I'm lucky to be sort of walking distance from Comico Foods, which is run by Yu Azone and Masa Haga. And it's actually inspired by you had these really intense allergies. So she started a place that was vegan and gluten-free. And yeah, she runs it with her husband, and they have these really lovely like black sesame lattes and all these different Japanese teas. And I did a story for Good Food a while back about this, but Masa had this like really full-on injury where I think he used to be a jockey, and I think he broke his back, and I think he wasn't able to walk for like 6 months, and he wanted to become a barista, but his hands would shake so much from like trying to deliver coffee to a table. Like he just couldn't actually deliver coffee to a table because of that resulting injury and the very slow recovery. But now, you'd never know that about him because he, delivers a hojicha or like a black sesame latte to your table with no spills or anything, like quite confidently. And yeah, I just think it's a beautiful neighborhood place. And when I did my Sydney essential restaurant story for Eater, I also put Cafe Monica, which I wish I lived a bit closer to, but the owner, I think, is from Shizuoka in Japan, and he brings out lots of really interesting teas. Like maybe you could get a like really grassy sencha when you're there, and they top your tea with brown rice, roasted brown rice for like extra flavor, and they have really amazing tea wares as well.
Oh, wow, they sound amazing. And feel, you're putting me to shame because it makes me think of going to get my double shot flat white and think, God, live a little. I really need to get out there. So,
well, the good thing is you can enjoy all these things. It's not either or. You don't have to just be a coffee person or a tea person. You can enjoy all these things. You can be a non-drinker on certain days, and then you can enjoy like, a sake or Chenin Blanc or so many other things on other days.
It's so true. We live in an incredible space where we are able to have everything at our fingertips. So my last question for you is, what beverage, food staple is always in your fridge? If I was to open your fridge on a mediocre Wednesday, what will I always find in there?
Yeah, I do always have one of those shrubs in the fridge, and something that should be in the fridge but I haven't topped it up recently is I like to have some yuzu juice, and if you just add like a splash to some water, it's so delicious. And it's a trick I stole from when I went to Superiority Burger in Tokyo, and they have their so-called superiority water, and it is just tap water with a bit of yuzu juice, but that citrus brightness of the yuzu juice just really like makes that water next level. So if I had like a drinking tip, that would be my drinking tip that I've stolen from a place in Japan for your listeners.
I love that. Yuzu is just a miracle citrus, isn't it? And once you taste it, I remember hearing about limoncello, and no shade really to limoncello, but for so long I heard about this amazing liqueur and I tried it and it was just not what I imagined. And then the first time I tried yuzu juice, I was like, that's what I was always hoping for. It's so bright and floral and just heaven. It's an amazing, amazing citrus. So I completely agree with you. I think that's a wonderful tip to have. Lee Tran, it has been so lovely talking to you. I could talk to you for hours on end. You are such a wealth of knowledge, but your enchantment with food and your passion is so palpable. I can feel it through the headphones. Whenever you talk about food, whenever you write about it, whatever you're doing, the love and the generosity and the excitement, it comes through. And that's why you are such a good communicator. And Australia is very lucky to have you.
Oh, thank you. And I would say right back at you. It's so wonderful that you do what you do. And I think for me, like a lot of the people you cover, I don't really know them. So I really love, learning about like Navneet Singh and, him working with seaweed in his bitters that come from like the great Southern Ocean, and that seaweed doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So, I love learning so much from your podcast. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honour. I hope we get to chat again, and thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. Cheers to you.
Thank you.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.